Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories and it'll keep sending more your way. Story 1. The Hiker Who Walked into the Fog. Jake Martinez had been hiking alone for 12 years, and he'd never seen fog like this. He stood at the edge of what should have been a familiar ridge trail in Rocky Mountain National Park, staring into a wall of white so thick it looked solid. The fog hadn't been in the morning weather report. Hell, it hadn't been anywhere when he'd started his hike 3 hours ago under crystal blue skies. Now it sat before him like a living thing, perfectly still despite the mountain wind that whipped his jacket and bent the pine trees around him. The boundary was sharp as a knife cut, sunny trail behind him, impenetrable white ahead. Jake checked his GPS. The device showed his location clearly, but the trail ahead appeared as a blank space on the screen. That was impossible. He'd hiked this route dozens of times. Bear Lake Trail was one of the most well-marked paths in the park. He should turn back. Every instinct told him to turn back. But Jake had never turned back from anything in his life. Not when his marriage fell apart, not when he lost his job, not when the doctors found the spot on his lung that turned out to be nothing. Hiking alone had taught him that the only way through fear was straight ahead. He pulled out his phone to take a picture of the strange fog wall, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual in the mountains, but his phone had been getting full bars just minutes ago. Jake shouldered his pack tighter and stepped into the fog. The world disappeared. The silence hit him first, complete, absolute silence that made his ears ring. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of other hikers. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the fog swallowed sound itself. Then came the cold. Not the crisp mountain cold he was used to, but something deeper, something that seemed to seep through his jacket and thermal layers to settle in his bones. His breath came out in thick puffs that vanished instantly into the white. Jake couldn't see his own feet. He couldn't see his hands when he held them in front of his face. The fog wasn't just around him, it was everywhere, pressing against his skin like wet cotton. He pulled out his compass, old-fashioned brass one his grandfather had given him. The needle spun lazily in circles, unable to find magnetic north. Jake tapped it, shook it, but the needle just kept spinning. That's when he heard the whisper. "Jake!" He froze. The voice had come from ahead, soft and feminine, barely audible. "Hello?" he called out, his voice dying just feet from his mouth. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the pressing silence, and the whisper of his own breathing. Jake took another step forward, then another. The trail beneath his feet felt wrong, softer than dirt, springier than rock. He knelt and felt around with his hands. The ground was smooth, almost glass-like, and warm to the touch despite the cold air. "Jake! This way!" The voice came from his left now, clearer this time. Definitely a woman's voice, with an accent he couldn't place. "Who are you?" he called out. "Are you lost?" But even as he asked, he found his feet turning toward the voice. He knew he should stay on the trail, but in this white void, how could he even tell where the trail was? He followed the voice. Time became elastic in the fog. Jake couldn't tell if he'd been walking for minutes or hours. His watch face was impossible to read. The fog seemed to dim its digital display to a faint green smudge. His legs should have been tired, but he felt nothing, as if the white around him had numbed his body as well as his senses. The whispers came more often now, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another. Always saying his name, always leading him forward. "Jake, over here. Jake, don't stop. Jake, almost there." Almost where? He tried to ask, but found his voice wouldn't work. The fog had gotten thicker somehow, pressing against his throat. That's when Jake realized he was no longer alone. Shapes moved in the white around him, tall, elongated shadows that flickered at the edge of his vision. When he turned to look directly at them, they melted back into the fog, but he could feel them watching, following. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. He needed to get out, needed to find his way back to the real trail, the real world. Jake turned around, but the fog looked identical in every direction. No footprints marked his path. No broken branches or disturbed rocks showed where he'd come from. It was as if he'd materialized in this white prison. "Don't turn back, Jake." The voice was right beside his ear now, so close he should have felt breath on his neck. He spun around, swinging his arms, but touched nothing except the endless fog. "You're almost home," the voice whispered, and Jake realized with growing horror that it sounded like his ex-wife Sarah. Sarah, who died in a car accident 2 years ago. Sarah, whose voice he tried so hard to forget. "You're not Sarah," he said out loud, his voice cracking. "Sarah's dead." Laughter echoed from all around him, not Sarah's warm laugh but something colder, hungrier. "We're all dead here, Jake. That's why you came to us." The shapes in the fog pressed closer. Jake could almost make out faces now, pale, stretched faces with dark holes for eyes. They whispered his name in unison, a chorus of the lost and forgotten. Jake ran. He crashed through the fog blindly, his hiking boots slipping on the strange, smooth ground. Branches that shouldn't exist in this white void tore at his jacket. Rocks that couldn't be there scraped his shins. But he kept running, following his terror more than any sense of direction. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, angrier. They called his name with increasing urgency, as if he was slipping away from something they desperately needed. Then, like stepping through a curtain, Jake burst out of the fog. Sunlight hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled, fell to his knees on solid rocky ground, and sucked in deep breaths of thin mountain air. Birds sang in the pine trees around him. A distant group of hikers laughed somewhere down the trail. Jake looked back. The fog was gone. Completely gone. The trail stretched behind him exactly as it should, marked with familiar wooden signs and well-worn switchbacks. He checked his watch. The digital display was dead, the screen completely black. He shook it, pressed buttons, but nothing happened. His phone was dead too, despite having a full charge when he entered the fog. His GPS unit was missing entirely. He searched his pack, his pockets, even dumped everything on the ground, but the device was nowhere to be found. That's when Jake noticed the emergency beacon clipped to his pack's shoulder strap. The little red light was blinking steadily, indicating it had been activated. But he never touched it. He would have remembered activating his emergency beacon. Jake unclipped the device and stared at it. According to the small display, it had been broadcasting for 3 days. 3 days. Jake looked around wildly. The sun was in the wrong position, too low, too far west. The shadows were too long for morning. And he was hungry, desperately hungry, with the deep gnawing ache of someone who hadn't eaten in days. But he'd only been in the fog for, what? An hour? Maybe 2? The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountain walls, growing louder. Jake looked up to see a search and rescue chopper cresting the ridge, flying in a search pattern. They were looking for him. His legs gave out. Jake sat down hard on the rocky trail and tried to process what had happened. 3 days. He'd been missing for 3 days, but he could only remember the fog, the whispers, the endless white maze that had swallowed time itself. The helicopter spotted him and circled back, kicking up dust and pine needles as it landed in a small clearing below the trail. 2 paramedics and a park ranger jogged up the switchbacks toward him. "Jake Martinez?" the ranger called out. "Sir, are you injured?" Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. How could he explain? How could he tell them about the fog that wasn't there, the voices that called his name, the 3 days that felt like hours? "I got lost," he finally managed to say. "There was fog." The ranger looked around at the crystal clear day, not a cloud in the bright blue sky. "Fog, sir? It's gone now," Jake whispered. One of the paramedics was checking his vital signs, asking him questions about pain, about his last meal, about what he remembered. Jake answered as best he could, but his mind kept drifting back to the voices in the white. They'd sounded so real. So familiar. Not just Sarah, but others too, his grandfather, his old hiking buddy Tom, people from his past who died or disappeared from his life. As the paramedics loaded him into the helicopter, Jake looked back at the trail one more time. For just a moment, he thought he saw it, a thin wisp of white fog curling around the base of a distant pine tree. But when he blinked, it was gone. Later, at the hospital, the doctors would find him dehydrated and suffering from mild exposure, but otherwise physically unharmed. They would note his confusion about the timeline, attributing it to stress and dehydration. His family would be relieved to have him back safely. But Jake would never tell them about the dreams that started after he got home. Dreams where he stood again at the edge of that impossible fog, hearing voices call his name from the white. Dreams where the whispers promised him that next time he wouldn't need to leave. Dreams where he found himself walking, step by step, back into the fog that was always waiting for him in the mountains. And in those dreams, Jake was no longer sure he wanted to escape. Story 2: Cabin of the Screaming Winds. The rental listing had called it rustic charm. What it should have said was completely cut off from civilization. Emma pulled her Honda up the gravel road that barely deserved the name, wincing as rocks pinged against the undercarriage. Behind her, 2 more cars struggled up the steep mountain path, Mike and Lisa in their SUV, and David driving alone in his beat-up pickup truck. They'd been friends since college, but life had scattered them across different states, different careers, different lives. This weekend in the Appalachian Mountains was supposed to bring them back together. A chance to reconnect, to remember who they used to be before mortgages and marriages and middle age started weighing them down. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, just like the photos online. What the photos hadn't shown was how the trees seemed to lean inward, creating a wall of green that blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. The place felt isolated in a way that made Emma's skin crawl. "Well, this is cheerful," Lisa said, climbing out of the SUV and looking around at the towering pines. "Are we sure there's cell service up here?" Emma checked her phone. No bars. The listing said there was Wi-Fi. The listing also said recently renovated. Mike called out, pointing at the cabin's sagging front porch and peeling paint. "Unless they renovated it in 1987. David was already hauling bags from his truck, ever practical. "Come on, guys. It's 3 days. We'll survive without Instagram." The inside of the cabin was better than the outside suggested. Clean, if sparse, with a stone fireplace, basic kitchen, and 4 small bedrooms branching off a central living area. The furniture was old but sturdy, and someone had stocked the kitchen with basics. "See? It's not so bad," Emma said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her voice. She'd been the one to push for this trip, to insist they needed to get away from their busy lives and really talk to each other. They spent the first evening like they used to in college, drinking too much wine, sharing stories, laughing until their sides hurt. For a while, Emma forgot about the oppressive feeling of the forest outside. Then the wind started. It began just after midnight, a low moaning that seemed to come from all directions at once. Emma lay in her narrow bed, listening to it build in intensity. Mountain winds were normal, she told herself. The cabin was old, probably not well sealed. Of course it would be noisy. But this didn't sound like normal wind. This sounded like voices. Emma sat up in bed, straining to listen. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, rattled the windows, and underneath it all, she could swear she heard words. Whispers mixed in with the rushing air. She padded to her bedroom door and opened it quietly. The living room was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Mike was snoring softly from his room across the hall. The wind picked up again, and this time Emma heard it clearly. Emma. Her name, spoken in a voice she almost recognized. A woman's voice, carried on the mountain air like a secret meant just for her. Emma's rational mind kicked in. It was just the wind playing tricks, the way it whistled through the trees and around the cabin's edges. People heard voices in white noise all the time. It was a known phenomenon. But when the wind called her name again, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just outside her window. She crept back to bed and pulled the covers over her head, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, everyone looked tired. Lisa had dark circles under her eyes, and David kept yawning into his coffee. "Did you guys hear that wind last night?" Mike asked, stirring eggs at the stove. "Sounded like a freight train." "It was loud," Lisa agreed. "But it was weird too. Almost like..." She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Like what?" Emma asked. "Never mind. It's stupid. Come on, we're all friends here." Lisa hesitated. "It sounded like voices. Like someone was calling my name." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "You heard that too?" "Too?" David looked up from his phone, where he'd been trying unsuccessfully to get a signal. "You mean it wasn't just me?" Mike turned from the stove, spatula in hand. "Okay, this is getting weird. I heard my name too. Clear as day, around 2 in the morning." They looked at each other in uncomfortable silence. "It's just the wind," Emma said finally. "Mountain winds can sound like anything. There's probably some scientific explanation." "Yeah," Lisa said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Just the wind." They spent the day hiking, exploring the area around the cabin. The trails were overgrown and poorly marked, as if nobody had used them in years. They found old stone foundations deep in the woods, remnants of homesteads from 100 years ago, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. "People used to live up here," David said, kicking at a pile of moss-covered stones. "Can you imagine? Miles from the nearest town, no electricity, no running water. They were tougher back then," Mike said. "Had to be, to survive winters up here." Emma noticed something carved into a nearby tree, letters worn smooth by decades of weather. She couldn't make out what they said, but something about them made her uneasy. As they walked back toward the cabin, Lisa hung back to walk beside Emma. "This place feels wrong," she said quietly. "I know that sounds crazy, but there's something off about it." Emma had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it worse. "What do you mean? Haven't you noticed? No birds. No squirrels. No bugs even. It's too quiet." Now that Lisa mentioned it, Emma realized she was right. The forest around the cabin was completely silent except for the wind in the trees. No wildlife sounds at all. "Maybe we should leave," Lisa continued. "Cut the trip short. I won't tell the others you wanted to go if you won't tell them I did." Emma was tempted. But she'd organized this trip, convinced everyone to take time off work, to drive hundreds of miles to get here. She couldn't just give up because of some creepy feelings and weird wind noises. "Let's see how tonight goes," she said. "If it's really bad, we'll talk about leaving tomorrow." But that night was worse. The wind started earlier this time, just after sunset. It built slowly, a low moan that grew into a howl, then something beyond howling, a sound like the mountain itself was screaming. And underneath it, the voices. Not just their names now, but conversations. Whispers about things nobody else should know. "Emma, remember what you did to Sarah in high school?" Emma sat bolt upright in bed. Sarah Chin, her best friend junior year, until Emma had stolen her boyfriend and ruined their friendship. She never told anyone about that. Never. "Lisa, you know what the doctor really said about those test results?" From the next room, Emma heard Lisa gasp. The voices kept coming, speaking secrets, sharing shame, revealing things buried deep in each of their pasts. Things they'd never spoken about, even to each other. Emma covered her ears, but the whispers seemed to come from inside her head now. "You could have saved him, Emma. If you just answered the phone that night." Her brother Tommy. The night he'd called her, drunk and rambling about ending it all. She'd been busy, stressed from work, and she'd let it go to voicemail. Found his body 3 days later. "Stop," she whispered into her pillow. "Please stop." But the wind only got louder. A door creaked open somewhere in the cabin. Footsteps padded across the wooden floor. Emma forced herself to get up, to open her bedroom door. Lisa's room was empty, her bed still warm. The front door stood wide open, letting in the screaming wind. "Lisa!" Emma called out, but her voice was lost in the howling. She grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. The beam swept across the clearing, the edge of the forest, but saw nothing. Then she heard Mike's voice, calling from deeper in the woods. "Emma! Help me find her!" Emma followed the voice, crashing through underbrush, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. Behind her, she heard David calling too, somewhere off to her left. But as she stumbled through the dark forest, Emma began to realize something was wrong. The voices calling her name, Mike's voice, David's voice, they were coming from too many directions at once. She stopped running and listened carefully. "Emma, over here! Emma, this way! Emma, help us!" The voices were all around her, but when she shone her flashlight toward them, she saw nothing but empty trees. These weren't her friends calling for help. Emma turned and ran back toward the cabin, branches tearing at her clothes, roots catching her feet. The voices followed her, pleading, demanding, growing angry when she didn't respond. She burst through the cabin door and slammed it behind her, turning the deadbolt. Her heart hammered as she swept the flashlight beam across the living room. Mike's bedroom door was open. His bed was empty. David's room too. Emma was alone in the cabin, and outside, the wind was calling all their names. She grabbed her car keys with shaking hands, but when she tried to start the Honda, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. She popped the hood. The battery cables had been disconnected. All three cars were the same. Someone, or something, had stranded them here. Emma ran back inside and tried the landline phone she noticed in the kitchen. Dead. No dial tone at all. She was trapped. The wind kept calling, but now the voices had changed. Now they sounded like her friends, Mike's laugh, Lisa's nervous giggle, David's dry humor. But wrong somehow, distorted, like recordings played at the wrong speed. "Emma, come outside. Emma, we're waiting for you. Emma, don't you want to find us?" She huddled in the living room, every light in the cabin blazing, the flashlight clutched in her trembling hands. Outside, shapes moved between the trees, tall, pale figures that might have been people, if people could bend and stretch like that. Dawn took forever to come. When the first gray light finally crept through the windows, the wind died to nothing, and the forest fell completely silent. Emma waited until full daylight before opening the front door. Her friends' cars were still there, but her friends were gone. No footprints led away from the cabin. No signs of struggle. It was as if they'd simply vanished into the mountain air. Emma found the strength to reconnect her battery and start her car. She drove down the mountain road as fast as she dared, not stopping until she reached the ranger station in town. The rangers organized a search party, but they never found Mike, Lisa, or David. The official report blamed exposure and disorientation. "People got lost in the mountains all the time," the ranger told Emma. The wilderness was unforgiving. But Emma knew better. She knew they'd been taken by the wind, by the voices that called from the dark spaces between the trees. Taken by something that had been waiting in those mountains for a very long time, something that fed on secrets and shame and the bonds between friends. Sometimes, on windy nights, Emma still hears their voices calling her name. And sometimes she's tempted to answer. Story 3: The Vanishing Trail Marker. Klaus Weber had been guiding hikers through the Swiss Alps for 23 years, and he never lost anyone. Not once. He stood at the trailhead near Zermatt, checking his equipment one final time while his clients prepared their packs. The Andersons were from California, Tom, a software engineer in his 40s, and his wife Patricia, a teacher. They'd booked a 3-day guided hike through what Klaus considered one of the most beautiful and well-traveled routes in the Alps. "The weather looks perfect," Patricia said, adjusting her new hiking boots. "Not a cloud in the sky." Klaus nodded, though something nagged at him. The morning felt too still, too quiet. Even the mountain birds seemed subdued. But the forecast was clear, his route was familiar, and the Andersons seemed experienced enough for the moderate trail ahead. "We'll take the Hohenweg Trail to the Schwarzsee," Klaus explained, pointing to his detailed topographic map. "It's well marked, beautiful views of the Matterhorn, and we'll reach our overnight hut by late afternoon." They set off just after dawn, Klaus leading the way with his confident, measured pace. The trail was exactly as it should be, wide, well-maintained, with the familiar red and white painted blazes on rocks and trees every 50 meters or so. Trail marker posts stood at regular intervals, each bearing the distinctive Swiss hiking symbol and route number. Klaus had walked this path hundreds of times. He could navigate it blindfolded. The first few hours passed pleasantly. They crossed alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers, climbed through stands of larch and pine, and stopped frequently for Patricia to photograph the stunning mountain vistas. The Matterhorn loomed above them, its pyramid peak cutting sharp against the blue sky. "This is incredible," Tom said during their lunch break beside a crystal-clear mountain stream. "I can see why you love doing this." Klaus smiled. "The mountains never get old. Each time is different, even on the same trail." After lunch, they continued climbing. The trail wound through a section of loose scree, then back into forest. Klaus pointed out various peaks, shared stories of famous climbs, and kept one eye on the weather. That's when he noticed the first missing marker. They just crossed a wooden bridge over a narrow gorge when Klaus realized he hadn't seen a trail blaze in longer than usual. He stopped and looked back. The red and white paint mark that should have been on the bridge support post wasn't there. Strange. The markers were repainted every season. Klaus had seen that particular blaze just last week when he'd scouted the route with another group. "Everything okay?" Tom asked. "Just checking our position," Klaus said, consulting his GPS. They were exactly where they should be, following the correct trail. He must have missed the marker somehow. They continued on. An hour later, Klaus stopped again. According to his mental map, they should have passed 3 more trail markers by now. He hadn't seen any. Not one. He turned to look back down the trail they just climbed. The path stretched behind them, clear and well-defined, but completely unmarked. No red and white blazes on the trees. No trail posts with route numbers. "Are we lost?" Patricia asked, noticing Klaus's frown. No. We're on the right trail," Klaus assured her, though doubt was creeping into his voice. His GPS confirmed their location, and the path ahead looked exactly as it should. But where were the markers? They pushed on, climbing toward what should have been the Schwartz Sea hut. The trail remained clear and obvious, winding through terrain Klaus knew intimately. But with each passing hour, the absence of trail markers became more unsettling. It was as if someone was erasing them as the group moved forward. "Klaus," Tom said during their next water break, "I hate to ask this, but are you sure we're going the right way? I mean, shouldn't there be signs or something?" Klaus pulled out his map and GPS again. Everything matched perfectly. The trail, the landmarks, the elevation profile, they were exactly where they should be. But he couldn't explain the missing markers. "The trail is correct," he said firmly. "Sometimes the markers get damaged by weather or animals. The important thing is we're on the right path." But privately, Klaus was beginning to worry. In 23 years of guiding, he'd never seen anything like this. As afternoon wore on, the situation got worse. Not only were there no trail markers ahead of them, but when Klaus looked back, the markers behind them seemed to be disappearing too. Blazes he was certain he'd seen earlier were gone. Trail posts that should have marked their route simply weren't there anymore. The path itself remained clear and well-defined, but it was becoming anonymous, stripped of all the official markings that would identify it as a maintained hiking route. "This is getting weird," Patricia whispered to her husband, but Klaus heard her. "What's getting weird?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Well, we've been hiking for 6 hours, and I haven't seen a single other hiker. Or any signs. Or even litter. Don't these trails usually have some trash, at least? Water bottles, energy bar wrappers?" Klaus realized she was right. Alpine trails, even well-maintained ones, usually showed some signs of human passage. But this path was pristine, untouched, as if they were the first people ever to walk it. They crested a ridge, and Klaus expected to see the familiar blue waters of Schwartz Sea below them. Instead, they looked down into a valley he didn't recognize. A small lake nestled between unfamiliar peaks, with no sign of the mountain hut that should have been visible. Klaus checked his GPS again. According to the device, they were at Schwartz Sea. But this wasn't Schwartz Sea. "Where are we?" Tom asked, and for the first time in his guiding career, Klaus didn't have an answer. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "The GPS says we're at our destination, but..." He gestured helplessly at the unfamiliar landscape below. "Maybe we should turn around," Patricia suggested. "Go back to where we started." Klaus nodded. It was the sensible thing to do. They had enough daylight to retrace their steps, get back to familiar territory, figure out what had gone wrong. They turned around and began hiking back down the trail. But after an hour of walking, Klaus realized something impossible was happening. The trail they just climbed looked different. Not completely different, the general terrain was the same, but the details were wrong. A distinctive boulder formation they'd passed was gone. A creek crossing had vanished. The wooden bridge over the gorge was nowhere to be found. "This isn't the same trail," Tom said, voicing what they were all thinking. Klaus stopped and turned in a slow circle, studying the landscape around them. The mountains looked familiar but wrong, like a photograph that had been subtly altered. Peaks that should be to the north were to the east. Ridgelines that should connect didn't match up. "This is impossible," he muttered. "What's impossible?" Patricia asked, and Klaus could hear the fear creeping into her voice. "This trail. These mountains. They're not." Klaus struggled to find words for what he was experiencing. "They're not the same as the ones we climbed up." The sun was getting lower, and they were running out of daylight. Klaus made a decision that went against every instinct he had as a guide. "We need to make camp," he said. "Set up here for the night, wait for morning to figure this out." "But don't we have reservations at the hut?" Tom asked. Klaus almost laughed. "I don't think there is a hut. Not anymore." They found a relatively flat spot beside what should have been a familiar stream, though Klaus was no longer sure of anything. As they set up their small tents, the silence of the mountains pressed down around them. No distant sounds of other hikers. No helicopter traffic. No bells from the cows that grazed in the lower meadows. It was as if they were completely alone in the world. That night, Klaus lay in his sleeping bag staring up at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than they should be. He'd studied these mountains his entire adult life, knew every peak and valley, every trail and landmark. But somehow, impossibly, they were lost in terrain that shouldn't exist. When morning came, Klaus made another disturbing discovery. Their campsite, the flat area beside the stream where they'd spent the night, was gone. They woke up on a rocky slope with no water source in sight. Their gear was scattered as if they'd made camp in a hurry on unsuitable ground. "This is where we slept, right?" Patricia asked, looking around in confusion. Klaus nodded, though he was no longer certain of anything. The landscape seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it, like a mirage that rearranged itself whenever he turned his head. They packed up and continued down what they hoped was the trail back to the trailhead. But after 3 hours of hiking, Klaus had to face the truth. There was no trailhead. The path simply ended at a wall of impenetrable forest. No parking area, no road, no sign indicating they'd reached civilization. Just dense trees that looked like they'd been growing undisturbed for centuries. "Where's your car?" Tom demanded. "Where's the road we drove in on?" Klaus turned around slowly, studying the terrain. Nothing looked familiar. It was as if the modern world had never existed, as if roads and parking areas and mountain huts were just imaginary things they dreamed about. "I don't know," he whispered. They spent the rest of the day searching for any sign of the civilization they'd left behind. Klaus led them in expanding circles around the area where the trailhead should have been, but found nothing. No roads, no power lines, no buildings. Just endless wilderness stretching in every direction. As the second night fell, Patricia began to cry quietly. We're going to die up here, aren't we? She asked. Klaus wanted to reassure her, to use his years of experience to calm her fears. But he couldn't lie to his clients. Not about this. I don't know, he said again. On the third day, something even stranger happened. As they climbed what Klaus hoped might be a ridge that would give them a view of the valley and perhaps show them a way out, they found a trail marker. A single red and white blaze painted on a rock, exactly like the ones that should have marked their original route. Below it, carved into the stone in Klaus's own handwriting, were the words, Klaus Weber, Mountain Guide. Day 1847. Klaus stared at the carving in horror. He had no memory of making it, but the handwriting was definitely his. And if the number was accurate. How long have we been up here? Tom asked, reading over Klaus's shoulder. Klaus couldn't answer. According to his watch, they'd been hiking for 3 days. According to this marker, they'd been lost in these impossible mountains for over 5 years. That night, as they huddled around a small fire, Klaus began to understand what had happened to them. Somehow, they'd walked out of the real world and into something else. A place that looked like the Alps but wasn't. A place where trails led nowhere and landmarks existed only when observed directly. They were trapped in a maze made of mountains, and every path they took only led them deeper into the labyrinth. Maybe tomorrow we'll find the way out, Patricia said, but her voice held no hope. Klaus nodded and added another stick to the fire. He'd been a guide for 23 years, and he never lost anyone. But now he realized that sometimes, it wasn't the guide who got people lost. Sometimes, the mountains themselves decided to keep you. Story 4. The Shadow in the Tree Line. Ben Crawford had camped alone in the Smoky Mountains dozens of times, but he never felt watched before. He set up his tent in a familiar clearing beside Abrams Creek, the same spot he'd used for the past 3 years running. It was remote enough to guarantee solitude but close enough to the trail that he wouldn't get lost on his way out. Perfect for his annual solo camping trip, 3 days of hiking, fishing, and clearing his head after another brutal year of teaching high school physics. The October air was crisp and clean, tinged with the smell of dying leaves and with smoke from distant cabins. Ben built a small fire as dusk settled over the mountains, then settled into his camp chair with a can of beer and a paperback novel. That's when he saw it. At the edge of his vision, just beyond the circle of firelight, something tall and dark stood among the trees. Ben looked up from his book, squinting into the shadows between the trunks. A person. Definitely a person, though he couldn't make out any details in the dim light. Just a human silhouette, perfectly still, about 30 yards away at the tree line. "Hello there," Ben called out, raising his hand in greeting. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him at all. Ben felt a flutter of unease. Solo hikers and campers usually acknowledged each other, especially in remote areas like this. It was basic trail etiquette, born from the understanding that you might need each other's help someday. "You okay over there?" Ben tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The figure remained motionless, a dark shape against the darker forest. Ben stood up and took a few steps toward the trees, holding his flashlight but not yet turning it on. "Hey, are you lost? Do you need help?" The shadow didn't respond, but Ben got the distinct impression it was watching him. Though he couldn't see any details, no face, no eyes, he felt the weight of its attention like a physical thing. Something about the figure's posture bothered him. It was too tall, too straight, too perfectly still. People didn't stand like that, especially not for several minutes without shifting or moving. Ben clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing. Empty forest, just pine trees and shadows. He played the light back and forth across the area where he'd seen the figure, but found no trace of anyone. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there at all. "Must have been a tree," Ben muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. He'd been looking directly at it, and it had definitely been human-shaped. Tall and thin, but unmistakably a person. Ben returned to his fire and his book, but found it hard to concentrate. Every few minutes he looked up at the tree line, scanning for movement. The forest seemed darker now, more oppressive. He went to bed early, zipping himself into his tent and sleeping bag. But sleep came fitfully. Every small sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, made him tense and listen. Sometime in the middle of the night, Ben woke with the absolute certainty that someone was outside his tent. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. The forest was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. Too complete, too hushed, as if something had frightened away all the normal nighttime sounds. Then he heard it, a soft footstep on the forest floor. Not the heavy tread of a bear or deer, but the deliberate placement of a human foot. Another step. Then another. Someone was walking slowly around his tent. Ben's hand found his flashlight, but he didn't turn it on. If there was a person out there, a dangerous person, light might provoke them. Better to stay hidden, wait for them to leave. The footsteps continued their circuit around his campsite. Slow, measured, patient. They paused at the head of his tent, then moved to the side, then to the foot. A complete circle. Then they started again. Ben counted 12 circuits before the footsteps finally stopped. He waited, muscles cramped from staying so still, but heard nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and he drifted back into uneasy sleep. Dawn came gray and misty, with thick fog rolling up from the creek. Ben unzipped his tent and looked around the campsite. Everything appeared normal. His camp chair beside the cold fire pit, his food bag hanging safely from a tree branch, his fishing gear stacked neatly where he'd left it. But when he walked around the perimeter of his camp, Ben's blood ran cold. Footprints. Dozens of them, circling his tent in perfect loops. The prints were clear in the soft earth, large, barefoot, with unnaturally long toes that ended in what looked like claws. Ben knelt beside one of the clearer prints and held his hand up for comparison. The footprint was nearly twice the length of his palm, narrow and elongated like no human foot should be. But the most disturbing thing was how many times the circuit had been completed. Ben counted the overlapping tracks. The thing had walked around his tent at least 50 times, maybe more. Hours of patient, methodical circling while he slept inside. Ben packed up his camp quickly, his hands shaking as he stuffed his sleeping bag and collapsed his tent. Whatever had visited him in the night, he didn't want to meet it again. But as he shouldered his backpack and prepared to hike back to the trailhead, Ben realized he wasn't alone. The figure was back, standing at the same spot in the tree line where he'd seen it the night before. Tall, dark, perfectly motionless. In the gray morning light, Ben could make out a few more details. The thing was definitely humanoid but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, at least 7 feet. Too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. And it stood with an unnatural stillness that no living person could maintain. Ben started walking toward the trail, moving at a brisk pace but not quite running. He didn't want to show fear, didn't want to trigger any predatory instincts the thing might have. Behind him, he heard the soft whisper of footsteps on dead leaves. It was following him. Ben picked up his pace, still not quite running but moving faster than a normal hiking speed. The trail wound through dense forest, crossing and recrossing the creek on small wooden bridges. Ben's boots thudded on the planks, echoing in the still air. The footsteps behind him matched his pace exactly. When Ben stopped to catch his breath at a trail junction, the footsteps stopped too. When he resumed hiking, they started again. Always maintaining the same distance, never getting closer but never falling behind. Ben risked a glance over his shoulder, and immediately wished he hadn't. The figure was maybe 20 yards behind him on the trail, moving with a strange, gliding gait that didn't seem quite natural. Up close, it was even more disturbing. Its proportions were definitely wrong, arms that hung too low, a torso that was too narrow, a head that sat oddly on its shoulders. And though Ben still couldn't make out its face clearly, he could see that it was watching him with unwavering attention. Ben broke into a run. He crashed through the forest, his heavy pack bouncing against his back, branches tearing at his clothes. Behind him, The footsteps accelerated too, keeping perfect pace with his panicked flight. The thing was playing with him, Ben realized. It could probably move much faster if it wanted to, but it was content to follow, to maintain that constant distance, to let the fear build. Ben ran for what felt like hours, his lungs burning, his legs cramping, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool morning air. Several times he thought he'd lost his pursuer, but whenever he stopped to listen, those soft, inhuman footsteps would resume behind him. Finally, Ben reached the main trail that led back to the parking area. Civilization was only a mile away. Other hikers, park rangers, safety. But when Ben looked back one more time, the figure had stopped at the junction between the main trail and the backcountry path he just emerged from. It stood perfectly still, watching him go, but made no move to follow him onto the more traveled route. Ben didn't slow down until he reached his car. Even then, he kept glancing back at the forest as he threw his gear into the trunk and fumbled with his keys. The drive home passed in a blur of mountain roads and racing thoughts. By the time Ben reached his apartment in Knoxville, he'd almost convinced himself that he'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, isolation, too much caffeine. There were rational explanations for what he'd experienced. But that night, as he developed the photos from his camping trip, Ben found something that made his hands shake. In the background of a sunset shot he'd taken beside his campfire, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, was a tall, dark figure. Watching. Waiting. And in the morning light streaming through his apartment window, Ben could see details that had been hidden in the forest gloom. The thing in the photograph didn't have a human face. Ben never went camping alone again. But sometimes, on quiet nights in his apartment, he would stand at his window and look out at the tree line beyond the parking lot. Looking for shadows that stood too still, shapes that watched with patient, inhuman eyes. Because now he knew that some things in the deep woods didn't just watch. Some things followed you home. And late at night, when the wind was still and the city sounds had died down, Ben sometimes heard soft footsteps outside his building. Slow, measured, patient. Circling. Always circling. Story 5. The Cry from the Cliff. The scream echoed off the granite walls of Devil's Tower, sharp and desperate, and unmistakably human. Alex Chen dropped his rope and looked up from where he was securing his anchor points. 50 feet above him on the cliff face, his climbing partner Marcus was frozen against the rock, his head turned toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" Marcus called down, his voice tight with concern. "Yeah," Alex replied, already scanning the cliff face for signs of another climber in distress. "Sounded like it came from the north face." There were 3 pitches up a popular route called Durance, about halfway through what should have been a routine climb on the famous Wyoming monolith. It was mid-October, late in the climbing season, and they'd seen only a few other parties on the rock that morning. The scream came again, a woman's voice, raw with terror, seeming to bounce off the stone walls from somewhere above and to their right. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" Alex's heart lurched. In 10 years of climbing, he'd witnessed several accidents, and that voice carried the unmistakable panic of someone in mortal danger. "We need to help her," Marcus said, already looking for a way to traverse across the cliff face toward the sound. "Hold on," Alex called up. "Let me finish this anchor and we'll figure out the best approach." But even as he spoke, Alex felt something odd about the situation. The woman's voice was clear and close, as if she were just around the corner of rock. But Devil's Tower wasn't that kind of cliff. It was a relatively simple tower with well-defined faces. If someone was in trouble, they should be able to see her. "Help! I'm falling!" The voice was definitely coming from the north face, maybe 100 feet above their position. Alex finished his anchor and prepared to climb up to Marcus's position so they could make a plan. "I don't see anyone," Marcus called down. "I can see most of the north face from here, and there's nobody on it." That made no sense. The voice was too clear, too close to be coming from the back side of the tower. And if a climber had fallen from above, they would have seen her go past. "Maybe she's stuck on a ledge out of sight," Alex suggested, though doubt was creeping into his voice. The screaming continued, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes just wordless cries of fear and pain. Other climbers on the tower had heard it too. Alex could see people on nearby routes stopping their climbs, looking around in confusion. There! Marcus pointed excitedly. I see someone rappelling down to help. On the east face. Alex looked where Marcus was pointing. 2 climbers were indeed rappelling down from the summit, moving quickly with the practiced efficiency of search and rescue volunteers. They disappeared from view as they descended the far side of the tower. Minutes passed. The screaming stopped. Think they got to her? Marcus asked. Before Alex could answer, the 2 rescuers appeared again, climbing back up the east face. Even from a distance, Alex could see the confusion in their body language. They reached the summit and began setting up another rappel on the north face, the direction the screams had come from. More time passed. The rescuers rappelled down the north face, disappeared from view, then climbed back up. Their movements were becoming more frantic, more desperate. This is weird, Marcus muttered. The woman's scream started again, just as loud and just as close as before. But now Alex was watching the north face carefully, and he could see the 2 rescuers on the wall. They were looking around frantically, obviously hearing the same voice but unable to locate its source. Help me! I can't hold on! The voice seemed to come from directly above Alex and Marcus, maybe 20 feet up. But when Alex craned his neck back, all he saw was empty rock and blue sky. This isn't right, Alex said quietly. More climbers had joined the search. Alex counted at least 6 people rappelling down different faces of the tower, all trying to locate the source of the screams. But every time someone descended toward where the voice seemed to be coming from, they found nothing but empty rock. Maybe we should go down, Marcus suggested. Get help from the rangers. Alex was inclined to agree, but something kept nagging at him. The woman's voice wasn't just desperate, it was familiar somehow. Not like he'd heard it before, but familiar in the way that déjà vu felt familiar. Wait, he said. Listen to what she's saying. The screams had changed, becoming more specific, more detailed. The snow! I can't see in the snow! Someone please help me! Alex and Marcus exchanged glances. It was a clear, sunny October day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, much less any snow. I'm so cold! The wind is so strong! But the air was still, warm enough that Alex had been climbing in just a t-shirt. She's not here, Alex said slowly, the realization dawning on him. She's not here now. What do you mean? Before Alex could answer, an old man appeared at the base of the tower, shouting up at them through cupped hands. You folks hearing that screaming? Yeah, Alex called back. We can't find her though. You won't find her, the old man replied. That's Sarah Whitman. She's been screaming from that cliff for 37 years. Alex felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm sun on his back. What? Marcus called down. Sarah Whitman, the old man repeated. Local girl. Tried to climb Devil's Tower in a winter storm back in 1987. Got caught in a blizzard halfway up. Screamed for help for hours before she let go and fell. Fell where? Alex asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. They never found her body, the old man said. Storm buried everything in snow. But folks have been hearing her voice ever since, especially this time of year. Always the same thing, calling for help, talking about the snow and the wind. The screaming stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a radio. Alex looked around at the other climbers on the tower. They were all standing motionless on their routes, staring at each other with the same expression of dawning understanding. A ghost? Marcus whispered. I don't believe in ghosts, Alex said automatically. But even as he spoke the words, he remembered the familiar quality of the woman's voice, the way it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Believe what you want, the old man called up. But I've lived here my whole life, and I've heard that same voice every October for nearly 4 decades. Always the same words, always the same terror. Sarah's still up there, still trying to get someone to save her from a storm that ended 37 years ago. Alex and Marcus finished their climb in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The screaming didn't resume, but Alex found himself listening for it, half expecting to hear that desperate voice calling out from the stone around them. At the summit, they met the two climbers who'd been searching for the source of the screams. Both were experienced rescue volunteers who'd rappelled all 4 faces of the tower without finding any trace of a climber in distress. "Strangest thing I've ever experienced," one of them said, shaking his head. The voice was so clear, so close. "I would have sworn she was right there beside me on the wall." "Did you know about Sarah Whitman?" Alex asked. The rescuer's face went pale. "You heard about that, huh?" "Yeah, I know the story. Most locals do. But I always thought it was just a legend, you know? Tourist nonsense." "Not anymore," his partner said quietly. The rappel down from the summit felt longer than usual, every shadow on the rock face making Alex nervous. He found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see a figure in outdated climbing gear clinging to the stone behind him. But it wasn't until they reached the ground and started packing their equipment that Alex realized the true horror of what they'd experienced. "Marcus," he said quietly, "how did she know we were here?" "What do you mean?" The old man said she's been screaming for 37 years. Same words, same time of year. But she was calling for help, right? Asking someone to help her. Marcus nodded, not seeing where Alex was going with this. So who was she calling to in all those years when nobody was climbing? Who was she asking for help on all those winter days when the tower was empty? Marcus's face went white as the implication sank in. She wasn't just replaying her death, Alex continued. She was responding to us. She knew we were there, knew we could hear her. She's been waiting up there for 37 years, and every time someone comes close enough, she tries to get them to save her. They finished packing in silence and walked back to their car. But as they drove away from Devil's Tower, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they'd left something unfinished. Sarah Whitman was still up there, still trapped in her moment of terror, still calling out for help that would never come. And she would keep calling, keep screaming, keep hoping that someday, someone would finally be able to reach her through the snow and wind of a storm that existed only in her memory. Alex never climbed Devil's Tower again. But sometimes, on quiet October nights, he thought he could hear her voice carried on the wind, desperate, pleading, forever asking for help from a world that had moved on without her. And sometimes, in his darkest moments, Alex wondered if someday he might answer. Story 6. The Frozen Man in Glacier Pass. Ryan and Carla had been snowmobiling together for 8 years, but they'd never seen anything like the figure standing in the middle of Glacier Pass. They'd left the lodge in Cook City before dawn, planning a full day of riding the high country trails near Yellowstone's northeast boundary. The fresh powder was perfect, the sky was clear, and they had the backcountry almost entirely to themselves. Ryan throttled back his Polaris as they crested the ridge overlooking Glacier Pass, a narrow valley carved between two massive peaks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine snow, and the silence was broken only by the idle rumble of their machines. That's when Carla pointed toward the bottom of the valley. "Ryan, look! Is that a person?" Ryan pulled off his helmet and squinted against the snow glare. About 200 yards down the slope, a dark figure stood motionless in the deep snow. Even from a distance, something about it looked wrong. "Probably just a tree stump," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "The snow plays tricks on your eyes up here." But as they descended into the pass, it became clear that the figure was definitely human. A man, standing upright in snow that should have been waist deep, wearing what looked like old-fashioned winter clothing. He wasn't moving at all, not shifting his weight, not looking around, not acknowledging their approach despite the noise of their snowmobiles. "Hey!" Carla called out as they got closer. "You okay?" No response. The man stood perfectly still, facing up the valley toward the peaks beyond. Ryan killed his engine and climbed off his sled. Something was very wrong here. The man was standing on top of the snow as if it were solid ground, but Ryan's boots immediately sank knee-deep when he stepped off the packed trail. "Sir? Are you all right?" Ryan called out, struggling through the deep powder toward the figure. As he got closer, Ryan's blood turned to ice water. The man was frozen solid. His face was pale blue-white, covered with a thin layer of frost. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows and beard. His eyes were wide open, staring up the valley with an expression of intense concentration, as if he were watching something in the distance. But the most disturbing thing was his clothing. The man wore a heavy wool coat that looked like it was from the 1950s, leather boots that were cracked with age, and a fur hat that had seen better decades. Everything about him suggested he'd been standing there for a very long time. "Carla," Ryan called back, his voice tight with shock. "Call for help. Now." Carla was already pulling out her satellite phone, but she kept staring at the frozen man. "How is he standing like that? He should have sunk into the snow." Ryan circled the figure carefully. The man's feet were indeed resting on top of the snow, not sinking in despite what must be considerable weight. It was as if the snow beneath him had frozen into solid ice, creating a pedestal that held him upright. "No signal," Carla reported, holding up her phone. "We're too deep in the valley." Ryan studied the frozen man's face more closely. Despite the frost and the blue tinge of extreme cold, the features were remarkably well preserved. The man looked to be in his 30s, with strong Nordic features and pale eyes that seemed to be looking at something specific in the distance. "What do you think he's staring at?" Carla asked, coming up beside Ryan. Ryan followed the man's gaze up the valley. The terrain rose steeply toward a narrow gap between two peaks, a route that would be nearly impossible to navigate on foot, especially in winter conditions. "I don't know," Ryan said. "But he's been looking at it for a long time." They tried moving the body, but it was frozen solid to whatever ice formation held it upright. The man didn't budge, didn't shift, remained as immovable as a statue carved from the mountain itself. "We need to get help," Ryan said. "This is way above our pay grade." They marked the location on their GPS and rode hard back toward Cook City, where Ryan used the lodge's landline to call the Park Service and the county sheriff. Within 2 hours, a search and rescue team was assembled, complete with a helicopter and several snowmobiles loaded with recovery equipment. Ryan and Carla led the team back to Glacier Pass, following their own tracks in the snow. But when they reached the spot where the frozen man had been standing, they found nothing but undisturbed powder. "This is where he was," Ryan insisted, checking his GPS coordinates. "Right here, exactly." The rescue team spread out, probing the snow with long poles, looking for any sign of a body beneath the surface. They found nothing. No depression in the snow, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. "Are you sure about the location?" the lead ranger asked. Ryan checked his GPS again. The coordinates were exact. This was definitely the right spot. But the frozen man was gone without a trace. "Maybe he fell through into a crevasse," one of the rescuers suggested. "The snow could have collapsed under him." But there were no crevasses in Glacier Pass, and the snow showed no signs of recent collapse or disturbance. As the search team packed up their equipment, an older ranger pulled Ryan aside. "You said the man was wearing old-fashioned clothing?" "Yeah," Ryan replied. "Like something from the 50s or 60s. Heavy wool coat, leather boots, fur hat." The ranger nodded grimly. "What did he look like?" "His face, I mean." Ryan described the frozen features as best he could remember. The Nordic looks, the pale eyes, the expression of intense concentration. "Jesus," the ranger whispered. "That sounds like Eric Johansson." "Who?" "Local legend. Norwegian immigrant who came here in the 1950s, worked as a hunting guide. In 1961, he went missing during an early winter storm. Said he was going to check on some clients who'd gotten separated from their group up in the high country." The ranger gestured toward the upper end of the valley, where the terrain rose toward the narrow gap between peaks. "He was last seen heading up that way, toward what folks call the Devil's Gap. Never came back. They searched for weeks but never found any trace of him. Ryan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You think that was him? After all these years? I think, the ranger said carefully, that these mountains don't always give up their dead the way they should. Especially not someone who died trying to save others. That night at the lodge, Ryan couldn't stop thinking about the frozen man's expression. That look of intense concentration, as if he were watching something important in the distance. He was still looking for them, Ryan said suddenly. What? Carla looked up from her hot chocolate. The frozen man. Eric Johansson. He was still looking for his missing clients. That's why he was staring up the valley. He was still searching. Carla shivered. After 60 years? Time probably doesn't mean much when you're frozen solid, Ryan said. Maybe for him, it's still 1961. Maybe he's still trying to complete his rescue mission. An old-timer at the lodge overheard their conversation and came over to their table. You folks the ones who found the Watcher today? The what? Ryan asked. That's what we call him around here. The Watcher in Glacier Pass. Been seen on and off for decades, always in the same spot, always looking up toward Devil's Gap. Most folks think it's just stories, but... The old man leaned in closer. Jesus, the ranger whispered. That sounds like Eric Johansson. Who? Local legend. Norwegian immigrant who came here in the 1950s, worked as a hunting guide. In 1961, he went missing during an early winter storm. Said he was going to check on some clients who'd gotten separated from their group up in the high country. The ranger gestured toward the upper end of the valley, where the terrain rose toward the narrow gap between peaks. He was last seen heading up that way, toward what folks call the Devil's Gap. Never came back. They searched for weeks but never found any trace of him. Ryan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You think that was him? After all these years? I think, the ranger said carefully, that these mountains don't always give up their dead the way they should. Especially not someone who died trying to save others. That night at the lodge, Ryan couldn't stop thinking about the frozen man's expression. That look of intense concentration, as if he were watching something important in the distance. He was still looking for them, Ryan said suddenly. What? Carla looked up from her hot chocolate. The frozen man. Eric Johansson. He was still looking for his missing clients. That's why he was staring up the valley. He was still searching. Carla shivered. After 60 years? Time probably doesn't mean much when you're frozen solid, Ryan said. Maybe for him, it's still 1961. Maybe he's still trying to complete his rescue mission. An old-timer at the lodge overheard their conversation and came over to their table. You folks the ones who found the Watcher today? The what? Ryan asked. That's what we call him around here. The Watcher in Glacier Pass. Been seen on and off for decades, always in the same spot, always looking up toward Devil's Gap. Most folks think it's just stories, but... The old man leaned in closer. This time, Ryan didn't approach. He and Carla sat on their snowmobiles at the top of the ridge, watching the motionless figure in the distance. What do we do? Carla whispered. Ryan thought about it for a long moment. They could report it again, bring another search team, go through the same futile process of finding nothing when they returned with help. Or they could let Eric Johansson continue his eternal watch, his endless search for people who were beyond saving. We leave him alone, Ryan said finally. Some duties are too important to abandon, even in death. They rode away without looking back. But Ryan knew that someday, when the snow was deep and the morning was clear, the Watcher would still be there in Glacier Pass, frozen in time and purpose, forever searching the mountains for souls he could never save.